We begin with a thought from the great philosopher Marx. I refer, of course, to Groucho, not to that other hack. But Groucho said, "Outside of a dog, a book is a man's best friend. But inside of a dog, it's too dark to read." Words of wisdom, my friends. Well, another month has come and gone. I really don't know where the time goes. I suppose after you see what I've been reading, you might guess that's where the time has gone, and I can't entirely disagree, but it does seem like even time for reading is slipping away faster and faster every year. Someday I need to interview some really hyper-productive people and learn their secrets, because I feel like I'm pretty much always working, and yet I don't ever get as much done as I'd like to. I don't really understand it. Maybe if this channel ever really takes off and starts making me some actual money, I'll be able to hire assistants. That's the ticket, assistants. And yes, that is in fact a hint for you to like, subscribe, comment, and share, and all of that sort of stuff to help me achieve said goals. But none of that is any of here nor there. What we're really gathered for today is to talk about some books. I read several books this month, or I should say last month, and as you know, if you've been around this channel for even a little while, I make one of these videos every month in which I review and discuss everything that I read during the previous month. So, this is the one for July of 2025. As y'all also know, this is of course a horror channel, so there's usually a lot of horror in the mix, and in fact there is. But I also talk about all the books I read, so some of them might, and in fact some of these do, deviate from our favorite genre. I suppose the last thing I need to remind you of before we begin is that I also put purchase links down in the What's It, so if you happen to be interested in getting copies of these books for yourselves, you can find them there, and that's also a great way to help support my work here on this channel. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Though not every book I read this month was horror, several of them were, including the first one, which is called Who Put Bella in the Witch Elm by Blake Myers. This is a fascinating blend of true crime mystery, police procedural, and supernatural horror. The basis of the story is a real mystery, a real world, a true mystery. In April of 1943, the skeletal remains of an unidentified woman were discovered in a witch elm, also sometimes called a witch hazel, in the village of Hagley in Worcestershire. In all the decades since, no one has been able to figure out who she was or how she came to be inside aforementioned tree. But graffiti asking the same question as in this book's title, Who Put Bella in the Witch Elm, gave her a pseudonym, at least, a way to refer to the victim, and this graffiti started to pop up all around the village. What the author Blake Myers has done here is to take that real-world mystery as a jumping-off point, and then to introduce a fictional cast of characters, including a main character who inherits the cold case, the same one we've been talking about, when she takes over as a forensic investigator. But along the way, she discovers both that the village seems to be keeping some strange secrets, including rituals connected to Bella's case, and then the villagers, including our main character, start experiencing ghostly supernatural occurrences. In that way, the novel reads as something of a hybrid between a police procedural mystery novel and a supernatural horror novel. Perhaps sometimes it struggles a bit to maintain both of those threads simultaneously, and thus occasionally seems instead to alternate between the procedural and the horror. But that's only a minor criticism, because both stories are entirely interesting and engaging throughout, even if they are alternating. While I didn't find the horror elements truly scary, I think it's safe to attribute that to my own jaded desensitization to the genre rather than to any lack of frightening subject matter in the story. This is as frightening as most other ghost stories ought to be. I just happen to read so much horror that, well, nothing really scares me anymore, so that's not a criticism of this book. Because this does fictionalize a true unsolved cold case, I also had some initial concerns regarding how it might end. Leaving the case unsolved at the end of the book would seem to be narratively dissatisfactory, although it would be true to real world, to real history. But supplying a fictional solution to a real case could be historically wrong somehow, or could anger people, or could just sort of leave a bad taste in the reader's mouth if it was done without all due care. I have to say, though, I'm pleasantly surprised by how well the author managed to thread that needle. I won't spoil the ending. I won't spoil anything of any of these books, as a matter of fact. These are spoiler-free reviews. But I will say that I was pleased on both the historic and literary levels with how the author managed to bring everything to a conclusion. The author also includes an afterword at the end of the book in which he clearly spells out which elements are real and which are products of his own imagination. So the book does come to an ending, but that way you won't be left with any undue confusion as to what was real, what was true to history versus what was fictionalized, and I think that's an important touch on this kind of a novel. I believe this is the author's first novel. With a debut this strong, I will most assuredly come back for the second. Next up was kind of a horror novel, and kind of not, generally not considered one, but I think I can make a case, because the one I read next was The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. If you look around social media or ask around at your local book club, you're probably going to find that opinions on this novel generally center on one of two ideas. Either people consider it one of the finest and deepest and most important books they've ever read and count it among their personal favorites, if not their singular favorite novel of all time, or you'll find people joking about which chapter they managed to get to before they finally gave up and stopped reading it. Though I find myself firmly in the former camp, I can understand the latter. Especially for a 21st century American, a 19th century Russian novel is going to pose certain challenges no matter what. Linguistic and cultural differences will make for a rewarding but challenging reading experience, of course, and that's certainly true here. But in this case, those issues are compounded. This isn't the kind of fast-paced, easy read many modern readers are looking for. Indeed, very little even happens plot-wise for the first 500 or so pages. Instead of plot and action, this book is driven by character and philosophy. And on that note, it is indeed one of the deepest and best books I've read. Few other authors are able to capture the issues and dynamics of faith versus reason, family, loyalty, envy, struggling, suffering, finances, social change, free will versus determinism, guilt versus innocence, and just about all of life's problems, better than Dostoevsky managed to in this remarkable book. It is a challenging book for sure, but if you give it due attention, you will recognize all of the characters. You will personally recognize all of the characters. They're people you know. The Karamazov family might well be your own, but even if you're fortunate enough to have a more functional family than they do, you know these people. You've met them, you work with them, or you've gone to church with them, or you've gone to college with them, or something along those lines. These are familiar people. And the same goes with all the other characters, not just the brothers and the father. Dostoevsky populated his novels with people so real the reader can't help but grapple with their ideas. And on that topic, unlike most other authors, Dostoevsky never made a straw man of a villain. He never did the mustache-twirling villain or gave all the good arguments to the hero and all the bad arguments to the antagonist. Indeed, to the extent that any characters in this book can truly be considered villainous, a lot of them are just deeply flawed humans rather than true villains, but to the extent they could be considered villainous, or the ones that we're supposed to root against perhaps, those characters often have better arguments than the protagonists do. And yet we're expected to draw the inevitable conclusion that the protagonists are on the right side of things, even though they're frequently bested by their interlocutors. And we do ultimately come to those conclusions. We struggle through it all, and we could recognize the brilliance, for example, of Ivan's arguments, but Alyosha is the one who seems to carry the day anyway. That's the strength of Dostoevsky's writing and characterization. So for sure, it's a challenging book. I get why many people struggle to get through it, but it's great precisely because it's challenging. It contains within its pages some hint of the answer to the psychological problems we've been struggling with in the Western world since, I don't know, at least since the 19th century. And this author's perspective on these matters remains valid today, just as the problems continue to shape our private thoughts and our public discourse, at least as much today as they did in the 19th century. As for whether we count the Brothers Karamazov as a horror novel, well, that's a tough one. At its heart, it is a murder mystery, even though the murder doesn't actually even happen until you're 2/3 or so of the way through the book. And murder and the horror genre, though a murder mystery and horror are not necessarily the same thing, those do seem to go hand in hand. But I don't think that's the strong argument to make this a horror novel. If we want to consider this a horror novel, I think the better argument, and the reason it could be considered a horror novel, if somebody like me wants to claim everything great for the horror genre, I think that reason is because though its goal is not necessarily to frighten in the same way a zombie or a ghost might, it explores the same philosophical and psychological ground that the greatest of horror novels also explore. It may not be meant to frighten, but if you pay proper attention, it can completely tear your mind apart in the best of ways. But as with many of the great horror novels, there's salvation to be found in confronting those monsters. And I think that's, even if you don't call it a horror novel, that's something it has in common, at least with the horror genre. It puts you through the ringer, but then you find some real wisdom at the end of it. So, I can say with confidence, if you've never read it, read it. If you have read it, read it again. Our next offering is just about as far from a horror novel as it's possible to be, and it's You Can Do It by the comedian and actor Rob Schneider. The reason I picked this one up and read it when I did is that I had an opportunity earlier this month to meet the author at an event, and I wanted him to sign my copy, which he did. And then, once I had signed copy in hand, I went ahead and read it, looking for some combination of thought provocation and comedy, and it does contain plenty of both of those. This is a weird sort of a book, and it's a bit difficult to pin down exactly what it is and what it's all about. The subtitle tells America to, quote, speak your mind, which fits precisely with one of the book's fundamental theses, namely that free speech has been under siege lately and is not only worth defending, but absolutely essential to defend. That more socio-political point competes for page space throughout the book with the author's memoirs, beginning with his family's history before he was even born, and then spanning his now fairly long career in show business and beyond. Both of those are interesting subjects, though one might expect that fitting them into the same book, and not a terribly long book at that, might be akin to squaring the circle. Somehow, though, Schneider manages to pull it off, and the book reads as a coherent whole rather than a mere collection of disjointed thoughts. Because of when it was written, it may come as no surprise to anyone that the COVID pandemic dominates a lot of the political arguments, though the book does veer into other territory as well. So it could be that 5 or 10 years down the road, many of the book's points might seem out of date and a relic of our own particularly confusing most recent half-decade. And I'm sure many readers will take issue with plenty of the author's ancillary political points, even if they find themselves in complete agreement with his more fundamental argument about the importance of free speech and free expression, particularly in the political and comedic spheres, which he argues overlap in certain important ways. Fair enough. I certainly don't agree with everything he's written either. There are points of agreement, and I agree with his fundamental thesis about free speech, but I don't agree with every ancillary political point that he makes. But I do appreciate the importance of being able to have those debates openly, and I commend Mr. Schneider for defending the role specifically of comedians as the essential court jesters who can make controversial ideas more palatable through laughter. Even if I might disagree with one of the jokes he makes at the expense of some political issue or other, I agree with his bigger point that we must be able to make those jokes. As for comedy itself, there are some laugh-out-loud funny moments in the book, but it's not as funny overall as his purely comedic work. He has a serious message which he's happy to deliver in mostly humorous form, but sometimes the seriousness of his point does mean the jokes have to take a back seat from time to time. In that way, it's not quite the book I expected to read, but I'm nevertheless glad I read it. The writing style is fun, light, and conversational, which serves well. Some awkward turns of phrase probably should have been caught by the editors and made me have to reread a few passages just to sort of figure out what he was trying to say. I think the goal was to present the text in the same style as a stand-up comedy routine, and it's mostly successful in that, but there are just those few places where I think the different media between the stand-up comedy stage and the written word just require a different style of writing. So there's a couple editorial quibbles, but that's a fairly minor criticism. Overall, I'm quite happy with this book. A couple awkward sentences and a few points here and there of minor political disagreement don't significantly detract from a delightful yet thought-provoking reading experience. The next one also isn't a horror novel, though it does cross over with some horror-related topics. The book is called Words from Hell: Unearthing the Darkest Secrets of English Etymology by Jess Zafaris. Divided according to topic into 10 chapters, this book is a collection of etymological histories of words describing dark, horrific, crude, or other untoward sorts of things. Each chapter begins with a brief introduction to the type of word under consideration, and then the bulk of the book consists of separate brief entries for each of the words themselves, with etymologies ranging from just a mere 1 or 2 sentences to a couple of pages in the longest ones. Overall, I quite appreciate most of the book, though there isn't really a real through line, making it somewhat difficult to want to read it straight through. Most of the entries are charmingly presented, and the reader is all but guaranteed to learn at least a thing or two about our language's history. Along the way, we also have the opportunity to debunk a few common etymological myths that get spread about on the internet. For example, the 4-letter word beginning with the letter F is actually not an acronym for doing anything of what we might call a private nature, whether or not under the consent of a king. The book falters in a couple places, though. A few of the entries are so brief that the reader doesn't really get a sense of how the word developed. Not that there's no etymological history, but it's just not quite enough in a couple of the entries. One could perhaps argue that this is just due to limited space in the book, and fair enough. Pages are expensive, I get it. But I would counter-argue that some of the author's witticisms, though generally enjoyable, could have been sidelined when necessary to make room for a more detailed description. Or maybe not. Maybe it is the wit that gives the book its charm, which is also probably true. Less debatable, though, and I think a stronger argument here, the author certainly could have made room for more detail on certain words had she avoided the temptation to inject some of her own personal political views into several of the discussions and several of the etymologies, which she should have avoided regardless of whether she needed to make space to expand the other entries, just because. Indeed, those political ramblings, though they do not take up much of the book's overall length, are the book's greatest flaw. That I even agree with some of them, although I disagree with others, is hardly the point. Rather, the point is just that it's simply inappropriate to preach one's personal politics in what is meant to be a light-hearted look at etymology. The reason I picked it up, personally, and indeed the reason I quite enjoyed reading it, despite those couple of flaws I mentioned, was to learn the histories of some words and phrases common in my own reading and writing. Specifically those related to things like the horror genre. For instance, it was quite interesting to learn that grave, when referring to the place in which one is buried, versus when referring to something serious, though it's exactly the same word and spelled and pronounced identically, these two words come from distinct sources. That is, although, one of those examples on which I would have liked a little bit more detail in the history. Another example. The jack in jack-o'-lantern originally appeared in the 17th century as a word for a night watchman. I also quite like the layout of this book, separating the words by topic instead of just an alphabetical list of all of the words. While this would ordinarily be a horrible way to arrange a sort of a dictionary, and this is a sort of a dictionary, it does make the individual chapters somewhat more readable. And if a reader happens to be looking for a specific word, they are alphabetically presented in the index at the back of the book. That index is a necessary feature because I do think most will probably consider this more of a handy desk reference or amusement rather than something to be read straight through from cover to cover. And I suppose I should conclude this review with the thought that people who can't differentiate between etymology and entomology just bug me in ways I can't put into words. My next one actually wasn't horror at all, but another cookbook. Y'all know I like my cookbooks from time to time. This one was discounted during Amazon's Prime Day event, and I picked it up on a whim because it was inexpensive. It's called The Best of Artisan Bread in 5 Minutes a Day by Jeff Hertzberg and Zoe Francois. I'm admittedly much more of a cook than I am a baker, but I have been trying recently to expand my abilities into the baking world. I maintain a pretty good sourdough starter, if I do say so myself, and I enjoy baking from time to time. Each time I seem to be getting just that little bit better, but admittedly, especially with my busy schedule, it can be challenging to find time to bake as often as one would want. That's where this book comes in. These authors have developed a technique involving advanced preparation that allows one to bake a loaf of bread not in 5 minutes total, that would be impossible of course, but in just a few minutes of active work each day, and then add on however long it actually takes to bake in the oven, which varies a little bit from recipe to recipe and probably from oven to oven. My recommended approach to this book is to read the whole thing cover to cover, at least skimming over all of the recipes included, which is an admittedly unusual way to read a cookbook, but I think it's important here to get a sort of big picture of the whole technique that they're presenting, but then to go back to the very beginning and start by mastering their first sort of master recipe. Master that first, and then from there you'll be able to adapt all the other recipes in the book once you've made whatever little adjustments you might need to make to account for your own climate, your own brand of flour, your own oven, whatever other variables might affect your baking. The thing that really impressed me as I started that process, though, was just how easy that master recipe at the beginning of the book actually is. I'm not going to say my first loaf came out perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but following this book's instructions yielded a pretty good loaf of bread, even on a first attempt, and subsequent attempts have improved incrementally, with each loaf being just a little bit better than its predecessor. Perhaps the 5 minutes a day claim in the title is a little bit of an exaggeration, but even if it takes 10 minutes of prep and then maybe half an hour to an hour of baking time, this is a much easier process than the constant kneading, stretching, and folding involved in many other recipes, and this is a true godsend for busy people like me. This might become my new go-to book for baking, both for the basic recipe and for the breadth of variations provided in later chapters. My next book is another horror-adjacent one from the non-fiction shelf. It's called On Monsters, An Unnatural History of Our Worst Fears by Stephen T. Asma. The author is a professor of philosophy, and the book is essentially a bird's-eye view of the history and development of monsters, primarily in the Western world, in folklore, mythology, biology, criminology, literature, and futurism. The first section deals with monsters of the ancient world. We then survey the subject through the medieval period, nature and science, psychology and criminology, and conclude with a look at the monsters of the future. Think of cyborgs and artificial intelligences and that sort of a monster. Overall, it's an entertaining and informative book, but it shines most strongly in its first half or so, discussing monsters of the ancient and medieval worlds. Chapters concerning more recent topics are still interesting, but the explosion in the types and interpretations of monsters in modern literature means a great deal of important information is necessarily omitted from the later chapters in the book. I mean, there's omissions from the earlier chapters too, but the earlier chapters seem to present a more complete, if not complete, history of the monsters, whereas the later chapters seem much more broad in their scope. And as the author tries to explore different philosophical interpretations, contrasting, for example, postmodern views of monsters from the views of the neo-Enlightenment liberals, the book seems on occasion to veer away from its historical presentation of monsters into philosophical debates that distract from what is, at least to me, more interesting subject matter. Further, readers interested mostly in monsters from literature and cinema may find the book somewhat lacking. These monsters are presented, to be sure, but sometimes take a backseat to the varieties of quote-unquote real monsters, whether actually real or imagined to be real, that people might think about or believe in. Still, one book can't be all things to all readers, and the information presented is quite useful. It's written for a general audience, but in a fairly academic tone that might turn off some readers looking for something more akin to a spooky story, but it is nevertheless accessible to anyone who might want to learn about how human societies, particularly Western ones, have thought about monsters. My next book is my last one that really has nothing whatever to do with the horror genre, so bear with me through one more non-horror book and then we'll get back to our favorite genre. The one under consideration now is Bruce Cannon Gibney's A Generation of Sociopaths: How the Baby Boomers Betrayed America. The fundamental thesis of this book is that blame for most of America's political and economic woes can be laid at the feet of that generation of individuals in what's become known as the baby boomer generation. Generally, those are considered to be the people born between 1946 and 1964, but Gibney stretches the boundary back to 1940, the first indication that he might be fudging some numbers a bit to make his point. More on that in a moment, though. Gibney's real thesis here is that the boomers, while not all sociopaths as individuals, of course, have acted sociopathically as a collective in order to gain the maximum possible benefit to themselves at the expense of both their ancestors and their offspring. The reason I picked it up is the same as the reason I think is worth paying some attention to. It's useful to see political issues approached from a different direction, or a different way of looking at the problem than our usual left-right Democrat-Republican dichotomy. And to be sure, a lot of our problems have coincided with the boomers coming into adulthood, now entering retirement, and claiming the reins of political power. Indeed, just looking at the book's Appendix B toward the back shows how tax policy from 1973, when the boomers started gaining political power in large numbers, to the present, demonstrates that much of America's economic policy does indeed seem to have been crafted to support specifically that generation. There certainly does seem to be plenty of blame to be assigned there. However, the quickest way to lose an argument is to overstate it, and that's exactly what this author has done. As I mentioned earlier, the author started by expanding the years of the baby boomer generation in order to more effectively make his point. Perhaps an argument could be made that this is justified, but the author does not sufficiently justify it within the text. He then offers what is essentially a sort of a socio-psychiatric diagnosis of an entire generation, but doesn't sufficiently justify such a diagnosis either. He pays lip service to an attempt to explain why he thinks this generation in particular went so wrong, but ultimately he fails to do so, instead simply saying, they're so bad just because they're so bad, and using a variety of economic results to suggest intent without ever really making the case for intent. And then, when it comes time to suggest some solutions to the problem, he does little more than to suggest more of the same kinds of economic manipulation he just spent an entire book decrying, but this time to benefit the younger generations instead of the boomers. Maybe some of that is necessary, but again, the author fails to sufficiently make that case either. Not all is terrible. As I said, it is refreshing to see an author taking a different approach to political issues, and he does correctly identify many of the worst economic problems we face, even if one questions whether the blame ought to be generational rather than policy or ideology focused. And to be sure, the boomer generation, even if not disproportionately sociopathic as the author contends, does deserve a share of the blame simply because they've wielded the levers of power for as long as they have. But ultimately, while interesting and while certainly worth reading, the book simply fails to defend its own thesis. That brings us back to the horror novels with a book that's arguably become something of a genre classic since its release in the mid-1970s, and that's The Rats by James Herbert. In many ways, this book is exactly what you'd expect a horror novel called The Rat to be. It finds its monster in the swarms of rats that seem poised to completely upend civilization. True, these are no ordinary rats, they've been supercharged in a way, but that's almost beside the point, as I imagine anyone with a fear of rodents would be just about as afraid of any rat swarm, though admittedly also their overpowered characteristics do add layers of danger for the characters in the book. This is a classical kind of horror. It deals with some deep issues, yes, as any horror ought to, at least any good horror ought to, but it never beats the reader over the head with it, and it leaves the reader free to interpret events according to his or her own philosophy. The characters, flawed though they may be, mostly seem to be decent people whose lives are upended by the unknown, and then their quest is to put things right. That is, I think, what good classic horror is really all about. That it's mostly fast-paced and brutal just makes it all the more fun. We need more horror novels like this. Its real strength, though, is not in its successes as a novel, per se. The overall plot is actually pretty straightforward. The real sort of nugget of gold hidden at the heart of this book is found in the various side stories and side characters who appear often only for one scene. Rather than simply showing us what happens when these characters run into the rats, we are treated to wonderful backstories of, not all, but at least many of them, some of which are even more interesting than the main plot of the book itself. That could be seen either as an advantage or as a flaw in the book's structure, and I'm honestly not sure which I personally think it is. But I did enjoy reading those side chapters. At the end of the day, whether you find giant rats terrifying or not, this is a quick and exciting short read you won't want to put down. I think we could all use some more horror novels like this one. We have just 2 more books to go now. One is fiction and one is non-fiction, but they're both very closely related to the horror genre. Before I get to those, let me just remind you that I have put purchase links right down there in the What's It, where you can get copies of all of these books for yourself. Surely, whatever your taste, you must find at least some of these interesting, and if that is the case, if I am correct, the best thing to do is to work on building your personal library. I've increasingly been on a crusade to encourage people to keep supporting physical media, and books are, of course, my favorite of all the types of media, although I like all the other stuff too. Using my links down in the What's It also helps support my work here on this channel, so you can get some wonderful reading material, you can support physical media, and you can support my work. Win-win-win all the way around. By the way, you can also help me out by subscribing, give me the thumbs up, leave comments, and perhaps most importantly of all, sharing my videos with your friends, family, and acquaintances. All of that is, of course, very much appreciated, but it's also neither here nor there. We are going to get back to the books. Our next one is the non-fiction book I mentioned, and it's called The Kingdom of Cain by Andrew Klavan, and its subtitle is Finding God in the Literature of Darkness. I read and write, and for that matter watch, a lot of horror, obviously. That's what we do here. I spend, therefore, a lot of time dwelling in the darkest corners of the literary world, and so I'm no stranger to those questions we all get. Why do you like that scary stuff? Doesn't it give you nightmares? Why not focus on the good things? I've answered such questions many times, including on this channel, but this book is Andrew Klavan's own answer to a string of similar questions. Though more of a crime and mystery writer than a horror writer, Klavan similarly spends his time in the literary world thinking of dark and horrible things. This book is basically his explanation as to why it's not only acceptable, but even an actively good thing for some of us to spend at least some time focusing on those dark things. The book is divided roughly in half or so. The first part consists of the tales of 3 real-world crimes, murders, and then a history of how they've inspired some truly remarkable works of literature and cinema. Had I written such a book myself, I would likely have chosen different examples, at least some different examples than Klavan did. At least one of them probably would have overlapped. But I don't think anyone can argue that he hasn't chosen some of the most frightening of crimes and some of the most horribly beautiful works of art for his discussions. In this early part of the book, we get a sense from a crime author's perspective of how the artist can find beauty, and at least in Klavan's case, can find hints of the divine when contemplating the worst events and sometimes the worst people the world has to offer. Indeed, he argues, even the Gospels, a word literally meaning good news, portray a story in which the ultimate salvation of mankind is extracted from the worst suffering imaginable. The second part of the book is a much more personal story. It details Klavan's own journey to faith and his personal philosophy concerning such matters as art, faith, love, joy, suffering, evil, etc. While the first part will appeal more to those of us who are interested primarily in reading about literature, the second part will likely appeal to those interested in biographies and memoirs and religious philosophy. But for me, as wonderful as the entire book is, and it is, I actually found the introduction of all things to be the very best part. There, Klavan succinctly lays out a passionate defense of the literature of darkness, even as he charges the reader to find joy in life. The human experience is complicated, and Klavan has done a great job of explaining why it's possible for some of us to find entertainment in such dark subjects, and indeed, why it might even be necessary for us to do so. This is a must-read book for those of us who enjoy what Klavan has called the literature of darkness. And of course that includes our favorite horror genre. Finally, that brings us to my last book of the month, which was Hidden Obsession, the first in a series called Deadly Desires by Natasha Carter, who kindly sent me this autographed copy. This is basically a suspense thriller in which the main character is a missing persons detective working on a new case. But it also incorporates plenty of elements of what I believe people these days like to call spicy literature, so it includes major plots or subplots to do with her relationship and a kind of nascent love triangle. But the romance side of things and the mystery thriller side of things are completely incorporated one into the other into a coherent whole, so I'm pleased to report the book feels indeed like a coherent whole. I will admit I read it much more for the mystery, suspense, thriller, horror element than the quote-unquote spicy element, the latter of which doesn't offend me but isn't really my cup of tea. Only in one scene, though, did the book's spiciness reach a level beyond my personal taste, and so I just skimmed over that scene just a little bit. I read the whole thing, but I read quickly through that one scene. And so it's a great book even for those of us who really mostly are only interested in the mystery part. On the mystery side, it's full of the kinds of twists and turns we all love, presented in a way that will keep the reader guessing right from the start. And that's a rare feat, because I'm one of those readers who can often, I might even say usually, see the ending coming right from the beginning. Not so here. Yes, I did figure out the big reveal slightly before it actually was revealed, but only by a couple of pages, so the author is to be commended for writing a mystery that actually maintains mysteriousness without ever leaving the reader feeling cheated. The ending does set us up for a sequel, which is already available, although I've not read it yet, and readers who enjoy this one will probably want to get a copy of that one as well. But though there are a few threads left open for the follow-up, the main conflict of the novel is satisfactorily resolved, so you don't need to worry about cliffhangers or whether the first one stands alone or whether you're going to be committing to reading the entire series. This can be read as a standalone. As for the romance stuff, I mentioned one scene got spicier than my own taste leads me to usually enjoy, but the actual romance of the romance plot was, I think, very well written. It was intriguing, and it incorporates itself into the mystery in such a way that you can't really separate one from the other, and that was a really interesting thing for me. So even though this one is partially within my own genre and partially outside of my usual genre, I found it quite fascinating to read, and I think most of y'all will enjoy reading this one too. Well, that does it. Another month of reading for me in the history books, so to speak. Obviously, now that we're a few days into August, my reading for this new month is already well underway with a similarly eclectic mix of horror and a smattering of everything else, so do be sure to stay tuned for all of that. But until then, or at least until we meet again for whatever my next video ends up being about, take care and stay scared.